The purpose of our vodcast today is to review regulation of metabolism, and I'd like to dive right in looking at the glycolytic pathway, also known as the Ebden-Meyerhof pathway, that absolutely is heavily regulated. We can call our attention to the three metabolically irreversible steps, step 1, step 3, and finally step 10. The regulation occurs largely at these steps, though I want to draw your attention to the fact that transport can be regulated. So note that GLUT transporters are often formed in response to high insulin levels and can help to increase or change the amount of glucose that's inflowing at any given time, being responsive to blood glucose levels. But let's now look at Hexo Kinase, the enzyme that catalyzes step 1. And remember there's more than one isozyme of Hexo Kinase. Most isozymes of Hexo Kinase are feedback inhibited by glucose 6-phosphate. That makes a lot of sense. It's just the feedback inhibition of that product. However, glucokinase is not feedback inhibited by glucose 6-phosphate because that allows for the synthesis of glycogen during times of plenty. Glucokinase, however, is regulated because with a Km that's between 2 and 5 millimolar, we can see that it only becomes active after a meal. So just the high Km of that enzyme serves as a way to regulate it. Let's look next at phosphofructokinase, which is the big cheese when it comes to regulation. So phosphofructokinase has so many levels of regulation. Number one, it's allosterically regulated, and there are a number of allosteric regulators. So I'm just going to draw an arrow up here so we can talk about those allosteric regulators. So ATP is an allosteric inhibitor. It's saying, okay, there's enough of this ATP made. We don't need to continue to run the pathway. It does that by increasing the Km. AMP is an allosteric activator, as is ADP. Remembering that nucleoside pool, that makes a lot of sense. Citrate downregulates. That's like the long-range feedback inhibitor, remembering that that's a TCA intermediate. So it's coming all the way back and saying, hey, we're getting our energy from fats. No need to run the glycolytic pathway. So that's a downregulator. Protons inhibit. So if you're really getting like ultra acidic, then the protons will serve to feedback inhibit. So PFK already has a lot of regulation going on, but this isn't even the biggest portion of the regulation. The biggest portion of the regulation actually comes into play when we're thinking about the fact that, and I'm actually going to erase this just to make room. We need to think about the fact that fructose 6-phosphate can get acted on by another PFK enzyme, not PFK1, but PFK2. So PFK2 can act on fructose 6-phosphate, making fructose 2,6 bisphosphate. Now, fructose 2,6 bisphosphate is a feed-forward activator of PFK1. It upregulates it. It's like an exotic form of feed-forward activation. The enzyme PFK2 has two activities. It's got a kinase and a bisphosphatase. So we'll say PFK2 kinase transfers a phosphoryl group from ATP onto, I assume an ADP there, onto fructose 6-phosphate to form fructose 2,6 bisphosphate. There's also a phosphatase activity of PFK2 that can take that backwards. So we also have, let's write this in green, PFK2, the bisphosphatase, abbreviating. So this actually allows for another layer of regulation because if we know that high concentrations of fructose 2,6 bisphosphate will lead to the feed-forward activation of PFK1, then there must be also regulation of the kinase and phosphatase of PFK2. So in fact, those are regulated. And for example, inorganic phosphate upregulates this. And as well as citrate negatively inhibits it. So citrate downregulates. Let's see how that makes sense. If we know that PFK2 kinase is active, we know that concentrations of fructose 2,6-bisphosphate are high, which means PFK1 is upregulated. So if inorganic phosphate is present in high concentrations, that means there's a need for ATP. So it makes sense to upregulate the pathway. Now, on the flip side, if citrate is present in high concentrations, it means that energy needs are being met by fats and the TCA cycle is going like crazy. So there isn't any need to upregulate PFK1. So downregulate that lower concentrations of fructose 2,6-bisphosphate and stop upregulating PFK1. Now, the bisphosphatase is also regulated, so fructose 6-phosphate actually will downregulate or negatively control the bisphosphatase activity. And so that makes sense because that's like a feed-forward activator. If there's lots of fructose 6-phosphate, just think Le Chatelier's principle, right? If there's a lot of that fructose 6-phosphate, then it makes a lot of sense that we'd be pushing forward and upregulating. So that you'd want to downregulate the bisphosphatase so that fructose 2,6-bisphosphate concentrations would stay high and upregulate PFK1. So let's talk about hormonal kind of global regulators. So over here, I've drawn glucagon binding to the surface of a hepatocyte and signaling very hungry, right? So the G-alpha protein has been activated. It's activating the adenylyl cyclase enzyme. ATP is getting converted to cyclic AMP, the secondary messenger. Protein kinase A is getting made, and that particular kinase has a couple of targets. So it actually will target, so protein kinase A, let me see if I can draw this without getting in the way. Protein kinase A will phosphorylate PFK2 kinase. So this is covalent modification. So we'll see the phosphorylation of that. And that will inhibit the kinase, activate the phosphatase, and we'll see that the concentrations of fructose 2,6-bisphosphate will go down. PFK1 will no longer be upregulated, and glycolysis will slow. That makes sense because the pathway that one wants to run in the liver when starving is gluconeogenesis and not glycolysis. So that makes a lot of sense to enact that kind of effect of the covalent modification. Do note that pyruvate kinase is also regulated. So pyruvate kinase can be downregulated by ATP. So ATP is an allosteric downregulator, allosteric inhibitor. It can be upregulated by fructose 6-phosphate, or fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So fructose 1,6-bisphosphate can be a feed-forward activator of pyruvate kinase. That's a plus sign. And we recognize too that this is also a target of protein kinase A, so it can get phosphorylated. And when it is phosphorylated, it too gets inactivated. And that step slows so that gluconeogenic bypass steps can begin to take over. Okay, in a nutshell, that is a regulation of glycolysis. Okay, I've cleaned this drawing up just a little bit so that we can look at the regulation of gluconeogenesis. And remember that for every one of the steps 1, 3, and 10 that are metabolically irreversible in glycolysis, those have to be bypassed. And in the first step of bypass, it takes 2 bypass reactions. The first one is catalyzed by the pyruvate carboxylase enzyme. And remember that is an enzyme that could play a role in the anaplerotic reaction for the TCA, or it could be the first bypass reaction for gluconeogenesis. The difference comes when that second bypass reaction takes place, when oxaloacetate is converted into PEP by PEP carboxykinase. And there is some regulation at these steps. So Pyruvate carboxylase is positively regulated by acetyl-CoA, so accumulating acetyl-CoA will upregulate that. PEP carboxykinase, remember when glucagon is high, that expression of the gene that encodes for this enzyme is upregulated. Additionally, we see another bypass reaction when we get to the next metabolically irreversible step. That is step 3 of glycolysis in gluconeogenesis. That is bypassed with the help of fructose 1,6-bisphosphatase. So the enzyme BPTase. This is controlled in a couple of ways. It's negatively regulated by AMP. It's also negatively regulated, and we can actually draw this pretty adequately, by fructose 2,6-bisphosphatase. So this makes a lot of sense because this is a reciprocal regulation. So we know that fructose 2,6-bisphosphate positively activates phosphofructokinase 1, so it makes sense that it negatively downregulates the reciprocal reaction. The other thing that can happen right here is actually substrate cycling. So we remember talking about the roundabouts and how that could happen in metabolism too. You can actually see a cycling take place when there's uncertainty in where metabolism is going between fructose 6-phosphate and fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Likewise, in the liver, remember that we can see glucose phosphatase, and glucose 6-phosphatase is in the endoplasmic reticulum. So in the liver, we know that this glucose 6-phosphate can go into the endoplasmic reticulum. It goes through the GLUT7 transporter, and in. And then there's an enzyme, glucose 6-phosphatase, associated with the ER that then allows that glucose to be exported. This is also regulated. That GLUT7 transporter will come across the ER membrane when the concentrations of glucose 6-phosphate are high and export is readily needed. There's one more layer of regulation for gluconeogenesis, and that is the presence of the non-carbohydrate precursors. So remember, there's a lot of things that can get converted into pyruvate. Those things include lactate, glycerol from fat backbones, additionally amino acids, right? Remember glucosalanine cycling. So if you have a lot of amino acids in your diet, or there's a lot of protein breakdown. So if the concentration of these go up, so say for example, you're running really hard intervals and you're getting really lactic-y, that concentration increase of lactic acid will push gluconeogenesis in the liver, and of course Cori cycling